My name is Robert F. Worthington, Jr., and I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee today. Today is September the 6th, 2006, and we're here to interview Senator Howard H. Baker, Jr. This interview is taking place as a part of the legal history project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Welcome, Howard. Your full name is Howard Henry Baker, Jr., and you were born on November the 15th, 1925. Is that right?
You've got that exactly right.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about your family. Your grandfather, tell us about him.
Oh, it'd be a long story, but well, to begin with, my grandfather, James F. Baker, who practiced law, but he was also the last baker to ever make any real money, and he died, as a matter of fact, months before I was born, so I never knew him except by reputation. But he was a remarkable man. And by the way, the firm has a replica of his law license, which, as you know, was not a license at all, but rather a decree of the court after he was examined in open court by a panel of lawyers. It's dated 1886. And we would have the original up, except the ink fades after a while, so we have a replica up. But he practiced law. He engaged in a number of business transactions, particularly the acquisition of real estate, and he did very well at that. But he was a lawyer, and he was a very good lawyer, apparently. By the way, we are fortunate, the family is fortunate, to have found his diary when he was 37 years old, a young practicing lawyer in Huntsville, Tennessee. He also practiced law here in Knoxville, but he gave his address as Huntsville, and that's as do I. But there's a great handwritten document, and I've gone through it, of course, and a few things stood out. But one in particular stood out that impressed me as I sat in my office in Huntsville, looking out the window. It was dated February 10th, 1897. And it said, "Nothing important happened today," which I'm sure must have been true.
Where and when was he born?
Well, he was born in Campbell County at Baker's Forge. He was the son of George Washington Baker, who immigrated from western North Carolina, a place called Cranberry, North Carolina, at the very end of the 18th century, 1797 or thereabouts. And he settled in Campbell County, and he and his brother and other family members started an iron forge. And to this day, it's known as Baker's Forge, although it's now underwater. When they impounded Norris Lake, it also inundated Baker's Forge. But that's where he settled before he came to Scott County.
And what year was he born?
Well, I'm hesitating because I don't remember, to tell you the truth, the exact time that he was born, the exact date. I should have prepared for that, but
I don't remember my grandfather's birthday either, so I relate to that. You mentioned that he also practiced law in Knoxville. How did that come about?
It's sort of the same thing. That who was it, the bank robber who said, "Why did you rob that bank?" Said, "Because that's where the money was." And my guess is, although I don't know it, that he practiced law in Knoxville because he thought it would be an opportunity for the profession, for his profession. But also I know that at least after a few years, he bought a house here in Knoxville at, as I remember, 725 North 4th, which no longer exists. It's been made into a part of the interstate, but he did that he brought his family here in the winter in order for his children to go to school in Knoxville, which supposedly were better schools than they were in Scott County in Huntsville. But so he had a split existence in his domestic life and – also in his legal practice. But he did well with it. It's been intriguing to me to compare his time and my time practicing law, because I opened an office here in Knoxville too, which this firm is the lineal descendant of. And it's convenient. I can drive from Huntsville to Knoxville in less than an hour. But when he did it, as he records in his diary, he'd have to take the train and change trains in Roane County, and then take another train going north to Helenwood, and then by some conveyance from Helenwood to Huntsville, which is only 3 or 4 miles. And speaking of his diary, I remember one entry when he records that he took the train from Knoxville to Oakdale, and he changed trains in Oakdale and proceeded to Helenwood. And when he arrived, there was 12 inches of snow and no conveyance. You could veritably see the indignity that arose from his person when he found that he was going to have to either walk or get a horse. Actually, what he did was rent a horse and rode to Huntsville.
It's what, 5 or 6 miles, isn't it?
3 or 4 miles.
Yeah.
But what a vast difference from the convenience of doing it as I did it. But anyway, times change and the profession changes, and there you are.
And Huntsville is the county seat of Scott County.
That is right. It was founded in 1847, 1848. And I sometimes see my mail misdirected to Huntsville, Alabama. And I carefully note when they send it back to me, or when infrequently a letter to someone in Huntsville, Alabama ends up in Huntsville, Tennessee. I put a notation that Huntsville, Alabama is bigger, but Huntsville, Tennessee is older.
He was a lawyer.
He's a very good lawyer.
And moved his practice to Huntsville when?
Well, he started his practice at Huntsville. And extended then to Knoxville. He was a specialist really in land law. And there are forms in Gibson Suits and Chancery that use some of his pleadings. And I gather from what others have told me that he was skillful in the old practice, that is, the common law practice, the equity practice. And he did it very well.
Your father was a lawyer too. Tell us about your dad. What was his name?
Well, his name was Howard H. Baker, as you can surmise, since I'm Howard H. Baker, Jr. But he was a double graduate from the University of Tennessee. He got his baccalaureate degree, his undergraduate degree, in 1922, and his law degree in 1924. Those were in the days, of course, when you could do both degrees in 6 years, 3 undergraduate and 3 law school. He was, I believe I'm correct, he was president of the senior class at the University of Tennessee when he graduated. I'm not sure whether he was editor of the Law Review or on the staff of the Law Review, but he did participate in the Law Review activities on some official basis. And while he never said so, I could always tell that he was grossly disappointed that I was not.
Now, the H is for Henry, Howard Henry. I've heard an interesting story about where that came from. Tell us about that.
Well, it may or may not be true. But a part of that legend, by the way, is that Jesse James and his brother Frank spent some time passing through and staying in Huntsville, and that my grandfather, got acquainted with them. The legend extends that as a result of that, perhaps, my grandfather was a partner with the James boys in a store in Kentucky. I can't verify that's true, but I can verify it's a legend, and that my late grandmother, his mother, was incensed when anybody told the story. But to continue with it, she used to contend, my grandmother Baker used to contend, that the name Howard Henry was borrowed from the James episode, because you may remember the ballad that the dirty coward who killed Mr. Howard. And Howard was one of his names. But my grandfather, I'm told, never brought himself to deny that, nor did he confirm it. But the legend persists till this day, and I've always taken some comfort in certain circumstances to being named, perhaps, after one of the great outlaws of all time.
Interesting story. Tell us about your mother.
Well, my mother was born in Roane County. She was a native of Oliver Springs. My father met her during his time at the University of Tennessee, and they were married at the time of her graduation. And I was the firstborn child. I barely remember, to tell you the truth, Bobby, because I was 8 when she died. And I must tell you, the loss of a mother for an 8-year-old child is profound. And to this day, there's certain parts of that and the preceding relationship that are sort of blanked out, or at least subdued in my memory. But she was a UT graduate. She was active in school and civic affairs. She used to be one of the volunteer coaches of the basketball team in Huntsville and things of that sort. It was a great tragedy when she died. It was a tragedy for my father, and certainly a tragedy for me and my younger sister Mary. But we recovered, and my dad remarried to a wonderful lady named Irene, and she, as our stepmother, raised my sister and me, and that was a great fortune.
Now, what was your mother's full name?
Dora Ladd Baker.
And she had an interesting mother.
Yes, she did.
Tell us about her.
My maternal grandmother, Mother Ladd. Lily Cox Ladd was her maiden name, or her name. Lily Ladd, and became known to everyone as Mother Ladd. My grandfather was sheriff of Roane County, and he was shot. And the county court elected Mother Ladd to be his successor. She may have been the first woman sheriff in Tennessee, one of the first really in the country, I guess. But she apparently was very effective. And the story that others tell, and she did not deny, was she had a jailbreak. And she and a couple or 3 deputies went out and found the escapees in the woods, brought them in, loaded them in her car, which was a Model T Ford, to take them back to jail. And she stopped at the grocery store for a few minutes and transacted some business. And somebody said, "Oh, Mother Ladd, weren't you afraid that they would escape again?" She said, "Those boys weren't going nowhere." And she was a remarkable lady. And she was a great influence on me. After my mother died, she came to live with us for 3 years, I guess. But she was remarkable.
You have 2 sisters.
That's right.
Mary, and what is her full name?
Mary Elizabeth Baker.
And I believe she married lawyers.
She did.
And you have another sister whose name is Beverly. What's her full name?
Beverly Irene Baker, and she's married also to a lawyer.
Also to a lawyer. Let's bring your dad's practice on up. We kind of left him in the 20s. He had several other interesting occupations.
Well, he was a businessman, and like my grandfather Baker, he did pretty well with it. But he really, and he was a district attorney general of what was then the 19th Judicial Circuit, which took most of his time, but not all of his time, and he continued his practice then, which you could do at that time. But he was district attorney for the 6 counties of the 19th Judicial Circuit at the time Oak Ridge was established. And that took a great deal of his time. He came home, I remember, one evening and was complaining bitterly that there's 40,000 or 60,000 new people in Anderson County. He didn't have any idea what they were doing or making, but that they all tended to get drunk on Saturday night, and that he had to deal with those cases. There was no sessions court then, and that he had a staff of 2. So that was difficult for him. But as a result of that period, he got very well acquainted with the evolution and development of Oak Ridge, which then, by the way, was known as Black Oak Ridge, and dealt regularly with General Groves, who was the executive officer who created Oak Ridge. Took me over there 2 or 3 times to see the construction projects.
Well, what were they doing at Oak Ridge?
Well, they were moving dirt mostly, but they were preparing for the enrichment of uranium for the first atom bomb, which was super secret. By the way, I was in the Navy when they, at PT Boat School in Melville, Rhode Island, when word came that they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And then they said it was built in Tennessee, Oak Ridge and whatnot. And, you know, it created great emotion in a lot of people, but what it did to me was say, I'm not going to have to be on the invasion force, the home islands of Japan, where almost certainly I would not have survived. But that's what they were doing.
Your dad ran for political office.
He did. He ran both for the Republican nomination for governor in 1938 and was defeated, and by Prentice Cooper, who became governor. And then he ran in 1940 as the Republican nominee for the Senate against Katie McKellar, Senator Katie McKellar. Did somewhat better, but was still defeated. But it was in those races that I developed this keen interest in Tennessee politics, maybe even a subdued ambition to do better in politics. It may help explain in part why I undertook those early and apparently fruitless efforts to run for the Senate in Tennessee, since nobody had ever been elected as a Republican. But at any event, he then ran, of course, and was elected to Congress in 1950 in a tough Republican primary, running against Congressman John Jennings. But he served then, till he died, he served for 14 years in the Congress, from 1950 to 1964. And he was remarkable.
Was on the Ways and Means Committee and has, by reputation, one of the principal authors of the 1954 Internal Revenue Code.
He was. He was the second-ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee, and was a very skillful lawyer and a very skillful tax person, partly as a result of his service there, partly because he was already a very good lawyer and a good understanding of the tax laws of the country. But he did well in Congress, and when he died in '64, in January of '64, my stepmother was elected in the special election and served for the balance of that term, which is almost 2 years, and then chose not to run again, not to run for re-election, which I guess in her case was the right decision. But anyway, she did a good job when she was there. By the way, my papers, my father's papers, some of my grandfather's papers are all in the archives of the Baker Center at the University of Tennessee. And we all have modest short-term embargo, or have had, on our papers, except for her. And she has an embargo of 50 years. And more than once, people have come to me and said, why did Irene put a 50-year embargo on her papers? What's in there? And I said, well, probably nothing. But that was her way of having a last word.
I remember that there was an interesting issue in your father's race against John Jennings. Had something to do with practicing law. How did that go?
Now, It was a tough race, tough primary race. And the Knoxville Journal, which was thoroughly Republican and in my father's corner in that primary, struck on the fact that John Jennings had accepted employment as an attorney on behalf of a private person here, or private enterprise here in Knoxville. And they ran pictures of the canceled checks and whatnot, implying that it was an improper thing, a conflict of interest. Looking back on it, to tell you the truth, it was not a conflict of interest. It was perfectly permissible under the laws at that time. It would be a conflict now. But anyway, that is the story. And you know, I've from time to time thought about that. It would be a very different situation. Yeah.
That's the reason I brought that up, is that it was not uncommon for members of Congress to come home and practice in those days.
Exactly right. As a matter of fact, it was probably more the rule than the exception.
All right, let's talk a little bit about you. First of all, what was it like growing up in Scott County?
It was wonderful. It really was. I was talking to Nancy, my wife, the other day about our place in Huntsville overlooks a gorge of the river. And I remarked to her that, you know, when I was a kid and my cousin and my friends were the same age, we used to go down there in the summertime to the river and spend the whole day. We'd play in the river and around the river, come home in the afternoon. If we did that now, if in the circumstances today, they'd probably have the National Guard out looking for us. But it was a very different thing. There was a high level of freedom and independence. There was a commonality of spirit with my schoolmates and friends. And looking back on it, it was idyllic childhood. And I'm grateful for it.
And where did you go to elementary school?
In Huntsville.
And where did you go to high school?
Well, I went 2 years at Huntsville. And then my father sent me to McCallie in Chattanooga, which is a great experience. And it's perhaps the most important part of my academic career were those 2 years at McCallie, partly because of the independence that came from being a boarding student away from home, partly because of the a different curriculum and level of difficulty of the courses. Partly because McCallie is a great school then, it is a great school now, but I also value that experience.
Were you enthusiastic? Did you want to go to McCallie before you went?
I don't think I wanted too much. I was intrigued with the prospect, but I didn't resist it. You know, if this is going to happen, you better just figure out how you got to handle it. But I do remember vividly to this day, Bobby, the day that my father drove me to Chattanooga to the school, took me in briefly, left, and the car pulled away. And I thought, I am here by myself. And that was a turning point in my life.
Yeah, I can understand that. Well, after you got out of McCallie, if I'm not mistaken, by the way, you are and have been on the board of McCallie for a long time.
Not now, but I have been, yeah. And it's still a great school, it really is.
How about college?
Well, back up a space there, because this is during World War II, and the period I'm talking about is 1943, when I graduated from McCallie. And when I graduated from McCallie, I was 17 years old, and I had three choices: either get drafted, or join the Army or Navy programs, whichever one you chose. Everybody got drafted, almost without exception. And to this day, I don't know why I chose the Navy program. Certainly there's no seacoast in Scott County, but I did, and I'm grateful. And then the Navy sent me in the V-12 program, the Navy V-12 program, which is an officer training program, to Sewanee, University of the South, which, by the way, it is a great school still, and I value that experience as well. And I spent almost 2 years there, a year and a half there. No, a year there. It turned out to be a year and a half of academic work because it was really telescoped.
Did they sing Sewanee was Sewanee when Vandy was a pup when
No,
you were
only
there?
only you did that after I came back. But after Sewanee, the Navy, in its infinite wisdom, sent me to New Orleans, to Tulane. I guess partly because I appeared to be pretty good at mathematics, and they decided they wanted me to be an electrical engineer. And I enjoyed that. I spent 2 years there. And then the war was winding down. It wasn't over, but it was winding down, and the Navy sent me to midshipman school. And I was there for 4 months in midshipman school and got my commission. I was then 19 years old, I guess, or 20. That was the end of the Navy-sponsored academic endeavor, but then they sent me to PT boat school in Melville, Rhode Island, and then off to the Pacific. But by the time they sent me to the Pacific, the war was really over, and I really am embarrassed to say it. I shouldn't say it, but the truth of the matter is I was a 19-year-old ensign with a fresh commission, no war to fight, and 4 months to spend in San Francisco. And believe me, I had a good time. But being of a tender age, I had a commission to the United States Navy. I was commissioned to fight the Japanese, but I got thrown out of every good bar I tried to get in. And that's it. But later I made up for it.
You and Jack Kennedy were both assigned to PT boats. Did you ever run across him when you were?
No, never did. And Bobby Kennedy was almost exactly my age, and I did get acquainted with him after we got out because he was on the staff of the Army McCarthy hearings. He was a minority counsel for the Army McCarthy hearings, and Ray Jenkins from Knoxville, who was majority counsel, asked me to come up and do volunteer work on the committee staff, which I did, and I was excited about that until I realized that my only duty was to read daily transcripts. So I got to go home after everybody else did, but that was an excitement. I did get acquainted with Bobby pretty well.
And then this was after you'd graduated from law school?
Oh, yeah, right.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Well, you stick around, Bobby. You'll learn a lot.
Learn something new every day. Okay, so when did you get out of the Navy and where did you go from there?
Well, I got out of the Navy in 1946, in the summer of 46. And the story I'm going to tell now is true in every detail. It is sometimes cited by other lawyers as a testimonial to my devotion to the profession. But the story is this. When I got out, like every returning veteran in 1946, I came over here to Knoxville to register, really to complete my engineering degree. And every veteran was back here then, and the lines were enormous. And I stood in line all day long, waiting to register. And I had 3+ years of undergraduate work. I was full of myself. And just as I got up to the window, they closed it. And I left in a fit of indignation and jumped in my car to drive back to Huntsville and thought, I will never come back to this place again. And drove to the law school, which was then on Main Street, right below the Church Street Methodist Church. And I looked and saw there was no line at all. And I stopped and I went in and I said to the lady at the reception desk, can I register here? And she says, let me see your transcripts. So she looked at the transcripts and said, well, yeah, you can register if you want to. So I did. And I went home and told my father I'd registered law school, and I thought he was going to absolutely expire. But he was proud. You know, I would then became the third generation Baker lawyer. And I had a good time in law school. I enjoyed it. I had good classmates. We studied together. sometimes prospered at our grade averages and sometimes not. But it was an enormously attractive experience to me, and I had a great time.
Well, let's go back a little bit. What were your plans? What were your thoughts? What were your aspirations about a means of making a living?
You mean as a lawyer?
Well, no, before you decided.
Well, as I've already said, I planned to be an engineer and to grow enormously wealthy with some new invention. But I went to law school because there was no line, and I've never regretted it. It's a great profession, and it's been very good to me. Law school is a unique experience. I hope it still is. But I'll tell one story about that. Judge Jones was a chancellor, retired chancellor, who taught equity proceedings. And Judge Jones knew of my grandfather's expertise in equity, so he expected a lot from me, which I'm sure I did not gratify him. But he was a man of some age and bearing. He'd show up, and he only had one lecture because of his age, and it was huge, a great number of people. And the judge would start out at a loud, sonorous voice. But as time went on, in a few minutes it would trail down, and being a large classroom, large group, somebody would say, "Louder, Judge." That went on twice or three times, and finally I remember it's George Morton, a lawyer here in town, in Knoxville, and George says, "Louder, Judge." And Judge Jones sat up straight and looked at the class and said, "On the judgment day, when the angel Gabriel plants 1 foot in the heavens and 1 foot on earth and toots that terrible trumpet, there'll be some damn fool on the edge of eternity who's shouting louder."
Did you ever think about going anywhere else to school after you got out of the Navy?
Well, I thought about it, but not seriously. And I did think about it. And I also thought about going to school after I graduated from law school. Jack Criss from Morristown was a good friend of mine, and he went on for a year of graduate work at Columbia, and I was tempted to go with him. But by then, my father wanted me to come home and begin my practice, and I did.
And he hadn't got. He wasn't in Congress yet. What?
No.
I
got out. I got out in 49. And he was elected in 50.
Any of the friends or acquaintances that you went to law school? How big was the law school then?
I don't remember the total enrollment, but it was a big class. In the class of 49. But we had big big classes, and it was remarkable.
What was your dad was still practicing when you got back to Huntsville? So it was you and your dad.
That's
Anybody
it.
else?
No, that was all. Then I hired you, but that was a little while later.
That was a little while later.
Yeah. I turned the books over to you. I didn't like to keep books. Still don't like to keep books. The way I kept books, Bobby, was to look at the bills and look at the checkbook. If there wasn't enough money, we had to figure out who to send the bill to. But anyway, it worked out.
It's been said that you were very good at figuring out what kind of bill to send. Do you remember who your first client was?
Goodness, no. I should, but I don't.
Do you remember what your first case was?
Don't remember that either. I remember that early on, though, my father insisted that I go practice law in what is now General Sessions Court. I remember also that I did a fair amount of appointed work in criminal court and circuit court. I remember also that my very best clients were in jail, and sometimes I was employed by someone yelling out the window as I was walking to lunch. But it was, it's a way to learn how to practice law in a hurry.
You tried a lot of criminal cases and several capital cases.
I did. I tried a lot of that. And, that's almost a vanishing experience for young lawyers now, or any lawyers. But I did a lot of that, both from an appointed counsel relationship and from paid counsel. It was, and let me tell you, till this day, there is nothing I can think of that has a more riveting effect on your attention and is a greater challenge to your ability than to try to defend somebody in a capital case. It really is, it's an extraordinary responsibility. And I don't remember exactly, but I think I tried one way or the other as paid counsel or appointed. I think I tried 7 murder cases, and that's pretty good.
Do you have any opinion about the death penalty?
I have 2 opinions about it. One, I think logic requires it. I think policy dictates it. I think the other opinion, though, is I find it personally abhorrent. But I have prosecuted cases and asked for the death penalty. So, I have mixed views on that. If I were put to the test today in a legislative setting in the Congress, I would continue the death penalty. But I would not be happy about it.
How many lawyers in Scott County when you started?
I think there were 6. The 2 Jefferses, O.E. and his brother were 2. Haywood Pemberton, who's an old lawyer, that makes 3. I was 4. Maxwell Sexton. I think that's all.
Now, Arzo Carson came along and practiced
Later,
with you for a while.
He did, that's right, for a while, after he got out of school.
Tell us just a little bit about how the circuit courts and the criminal courts, you mentioned the 19th Judicial Circuit. How many counties were in that?
There were 6. It's changed now. I think there are 5 now. But Anderson County was split off initially. But as I remember, it was Scott, Morgan, Claiborne, Campbell, Anderson, and Fentress counties. And I think Scott, Morgan, Campbell, Claiborne. I'm not sure about Fentress County.
Did you customarily try cases in other counties, either on the civil or the criminal side?
Both.
And everybody else did too?
Pretty much, yeah. We were all circuit riders.
Right.
Yeah.
The court would meet in Scott County how many times a year?
Well, it's a quarterly court.
4 times a year. And that would be true of the criminal court as well?
Exactly. And the one in Fentress County always met in January, and it was always cold, and it was always icy on the roads. I used to dread that.
Well, somewhere in there, along about that time, you met a young lady who later became your spouse. Tell us about that.
What do you want me to tell you about it? What's to tell? It's true.
Well, how did you meet a girl in Washington?
Well, she was actually from Illinois, but her father was in Congress. Her father was Senator Dirksen from Illinois. He'd been elected in 1950. And I met her, as a matter of fact, when she was a bridesmaid in the wedding of Louise Reese, Carol Reese's daughter, and took an instant dislike to her. The reason I was there at all was because my sister Mary was also a bridesmaid. But actually, the next week, I called and asked her if I could come up and apologize for having been such a bore. And she agreed, and one thing led to another.
Now, what was this girl's name?
Her name was Joy Dirksen Baker. Denise Joy Dirksen was her name at the time.
And how many children were?
how many brothers and sisters did she have?
No. Oh, she was an only child,
She was
right?
an only child.
No, I mean, how many children did you all have?
We had two. We had Derek, who was born in '53, and Sissy, who was born in '56. And by the way, I have 4 grandsons now, all Derek's children.
And one of them's graduated from college, I believe.
One is and has, and one is a senior at East Tennessee State, and the other 2 are doing well.
Howard, you mentioned Derek having, was it 4? Is it 4 children?
4 boys.
And what are their names?
Their names are Daniel Dirksen Baker, Matthew Baker, and Samuel Henry Baker, and Timothy Baker. They range from, let's see, Daniel is now 22, and Tim is the youngest and will be 12 this year. You want me to tell a story about them?
Yes, sir.
I remember, and I use this story from time to time, after I'm introduced occasionally with an overly flowery introduction on what you've done. You've been in the Senate, you were Chief of Staff to President Reagan, and you were Ambassador to Japan and all those things. I took Sam, when he was about 7, with me to a taping at Channel 5 in Nashville. They went through all this stuff. And he was a perfect little gentleman. He sat in the studio, never made a sound. And I loaded him in the car to take him back to his parents in Brentwood, Tennessee. And we were about halfway there, and Sam looked up and said, "Papa, did you used to be somebody?" Which is a challenge.
Indeed. Before we leave the earlier part of your practice, who were some of the early clients? They weren't all individuals, I don't think.
No, they weren't all. The Southern Railroad was one. I represented the Southern, actually the C&O&TP, a division of the Southern, and the counties for the Kentucky line down to, but not including Chattanooga. That was a principal client, and I did trial work for them. Represented the electric co-op, the telephone company, and a couple of the fairly large coal companies and lumber companies at the time. Those, I guess, were important principal and early clients.
What persuaded you to open an office in Knoxville?
Well, I mentioned earlier that my grandfather had done that. I think my father really wanted to, but it was Depression era. He was district attorney, and it really never worked out for him. He, I'm told, he told me, was offered to join a couple of prestigious firms here in Knoxville, but didn't do that. I guess that was background in my mind, but probably the same motivation that my grandfather had, that there are more practice opportunities in Knox County than there are in Scott County. So that's why I did that. And that's how you came into existence. You know, I was
That's right.
looking around for somebody to help run a Knoxville office, and you agreed to do that, and we started here. Had offices initially in the old Fidelity Bankers Trust building, and did pretty well, actually. But I guess that's as good as I can do with that. Why did I come to Knoxville? That's probably the reason.
And the firm was Baker and Baker.
That's right.
Going back to your grandfather, James F., your dad.
There's been a Baker and Baker a long time.
Right.
And my grandfather and my father, and then my father and I.
And then the firm joined with another firm.
Lindsay Young and Robert Young. And then it was Baker, Young, Young, and Baker. And that was a successful practice. And then I ran for the Senate.
But just before you ran for the Senate, we departed the affiliation in a very friendly fashion of the Youngs and formed another law firm.
That's right.
And what was the name of that firm?
Tell me, what was the name of that firm?
Baker Worthington.
Of course, Bobby. How could I forget that?
But it was part of the Baker and Baker,
Yeah.
Baker Young and Baker, Baker Worthington.
That's true.
And
By the way, I trace that lineage back to 1887, actually 1886. But when we formed this firm, Baker Donaldson, Louis Donaldson also, his antecedents were intimately involved with the legal profession in Tennessee. So the merger of the two has worked well, and it's a passing interest, I guess, at least to me, that two early practices came together successfully.
now, while we're on that subject, when you left to go to the Senate, there were, as I recall, 6 lawyers. When you came back from the Senate, there were a lot more lawyers who had accumulated while you were gone. But we had an arrangement with a Texas law firm for a short time. Tell us about that.
We did, Vincent and Elkins in Houston. And it was a double partnership then, because they wanted me to be affiliated with them, and I wanted to continue the Baker practice. And that worked for a while. It worked okay. And Vincent Elkins was, and is, a great firm, big firm. And it came about, really, probably more than any other way, through Robbie Mossbacher. Mossbacher's a prominent Houston family, and Robbie worked for me in the Senate. He really, really urged me to interview with them, and when I was leaving the Senate, and did, and that's the way that worked out.
So you were a partner in both firms. You were a partner in Baker Worthington, and partner in Vincent and Elkins.
That's right.
And then you got another job. Tell us about that. After you came back from the Senate and after you'd practiced law for a couple of years, you got an invitation to accept another job.
Well, invitation, I suppose, is an accurate description. But in the meantime, after I left the Senate, I ran for the Republican presidential nomination, which most people would remember unless they play Trivial Pursuits, but I did. And it was a great experience. I traveled around the country, and we had a good campaign. But after the Vermont primaries, New Hampshire primaries, it was clear to me that I wasn't going to be the nominee, and I withdrew and endorsed Ronald Reagan, who, of course, was nominated and elected. I say somewhat facetiously, though not totally, to young men and women, if you ever want to run for president, it's fine. It's a noble thing to do. But you've got to remember that you contract a terrible illness, and that is you wake up on some mornings and think, I cannot live another day if I don't run for president again. And I had an attack of that illness and that was in 1987, and gathered up my family, my late wife, Joy, and my 2 children and 2 grandchildren at that time. Went to Miami to have a family conference at the Seaview Hotel. And that conversation lasted about 4 minutes when it was clear that nobody wanted me to run for president. Nobody wanted to talk about running for president. So for lack of anything better to do, I took my oldest grandson, Daniel, who's now 22, I took him to the zoo in Miami. They have a wonderful zoo in Miami. And while we were there, according to Joy, President Reagan called. And asked her to tell me that he wanted me to come to Washington the next day. And she told me this. I said, well, what does he want? What does he want me to do? And she said, he didn't say. But at that time, in 1987, the Reagan presidency was sort of in jeopardy. It was really the low point of his presidency with Iran-Contra and all that stuff. So I marshaled all of my arguments the next day as I was on the plane about whatever it was he wanted me to do, I couldn't do. I'd been 18 years in the Senate. I was at the moment he called thinking about my own political future, if any, and I couldn't do it, whatever it was, having assumed he wanted me to do something. And I was met at National Airport in the White House car. They took me to the Southwest Gate, and in the diplomatic reception room entrance, which is the way you go if you want to avoid the press, and went up to the third floor of the White House, which is the living quarters. The elevator door opened, and Ronald Reagan stood there, and he said, Howard, I've got to have you chief of staff, and I want you to do it. And I heard myself say, all right. And that was the end of my presidential ambition. But to tell you the truth, I have no regrets. It was an extraordinary opportunity for me to work daily with Ronald Reagan. He was a great, great man. And I'm glad it worked out.
I want to come back and talk about that a little bit more, but just to finish out the law firm, and let's talk a little bit more about the Baker Donaldson merger. You mentioned, of course, Louis Donaldson and yourself, and how many lawyers in this firm now?
Now? You have to take a head count every day because it's a growing firm, but the last one I had said there were more than 440 lawyers and over 1,000 employees. And I'm sure my grandfather would be appalled. But it's a big firm, a growing firm, and I think we'll continue to grow at a pretty rapid pace. And it's not all ambition, it's the fact that the type of practice the firm now does is labor intensive. You've got to have the hands to do the work. We had an employment of a client the other day, and that job, that file, is going to require the examination of more than 200,000 documents by lawyers for a variety of reasons. But you've got to do that. You've got to be prepared to do that. And what I did was canvass each of the offices of the firm, all the way from New Orleans to Birmingham to Jackson, Mississippi, to Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville, Johnson City, Chattanooga, and to find the people to do that. It's interesting, too, as a sidelight, that you couldn't have done that 20 years ago. Even if you had the manpower, you couldn't have done it. The only way to do that as a practical matter is electronically, to transmit those documents and examine them and report on them electronically, which is what happens. But the Baker Donaldson firm is big and growing and will continue to grow, in my opinion. It's successful and profitable, and I'm grateful for that. But it sort of just happened. Louis Donaldson had been after me for years to talk about practicing together, and I'd always resisted. And it wasn't until after I came back that that I took it seriously, and I'm glad I did. I think it's worked out very well. And by the way, Louis is a work of art. Louis is energetic, enthusiastic, smart, quick, a great lawyer, and he's an inspiration to us all.
What's the full name of the firm now?
Baker Donaldson, Bierman, Caldwell, and
Berkowitz.
Berkowitz, there you are. I never met Berkowitz. I gotta remember.
Offices mainly in the southeast, but there's one office that's a long way from the southeast.
Yeah, well, one in Washington. We have, last count, I think 30 lawyers in that office. I'll make you a prediction now. Based on the type of work that comes to us in the Washington office, and I do most of my stuff in the Washington office, although I live in Huntsville and work in Huntsville, once again, electronically you can do that. But I predict that the Washington office one day may be the largest office in the firm. And it's with great pleasure that I can say that there's a lot of work comes in. And we expand to meet the requirement.
It's enjoyed some favorable rankings by Fortune magazine, I believe.
It has. I don't remember what it was, but it was in the
last
top.
year 7th, I think.
I think that's right, yeah.
Okay.
And by the way, they're very good lawyers. And, you know, as you would expect, most of them I'd never met before. But you get acquainted with them, and you count yourself very fortunate that after usually not a very extensive examination of their practice or their personality, they tend to fit. They work together. And that, I think, is the greatest attribute of the firm right now, is that they can meld together different talents and produce a good work product.
Contrast for us the practice of law when you started practicing and for a few years after that, and the way that practice has evolved.
Well, as you can appreciate, Bob, when I started practicing law in 1949, regardless of the size of the firm, and the firms weren't very big, if I remember, the largest firm in Knoxville was 5. The practice was essentially an individual practice. You were almost sole practitioners with a common address to bookkeeping and overhead. It's not literally that way, but it's almost that way. But now, the tendency is for firms to grow very rapidly, have a broad base of talent, and to have a lot of hands, a lot of people, a lot of lawyers that can handle complex litigation. There's still very good sole practitioners in our profession, but they're rarer and rarer. And I don't know whether to say I fear that will continue, or I observe it'll continue, or I'm pleased that it continues. But the practice now is very different than it was when I began, certainly very different than when my father and my grandfather started. But there are similarities too, because it's been my experience, and this is, I suppose, self-serving to the profession, that the legal profession has produced a great share of the leadership talent in our country. Corporate leadership, civic leadership, political leadership. And I think it will continue to, notwithstanding that the practice itself is very different. It still is a vast and effective training ground for bright young men and women. And it continued to be a hotbed of innovation, both commercial, industrial, technological innovation, but also in business and in the profession, the legal profession. It has worked very well, and I think it's headed in the right direction. What it will be in 10 years, I don't know, but my guess is that you'll see more 1,000-member firms capable of doing complex work. You'll see a predominance of them will be female, because the law schools now are predominantly female. I think that's good. I think it lends itself to the patient talents that women often bring to the profession. It's hard to say what it'll be like, but I'm confident of the future of the legal profession.
And most lawyers were generalists, very few specialists. Not too many years ago.
That's right.
But that's changed.
Oh, it's dramatically changed. And all you got to do is look at the little brochures that firms publish, and and they don't call themselves specialists, but they list the talents they have, the experience they have, and it in effect becomes an aggregation of specialists. We don't like that word, and in Tennessee, as I remember, we don't even certify specialties, but it happens. It works that way.
And I think it's interesting, contrasted with the medical profession, where people of the same areas of specialization grouped together. Most law firms have an aggregation of different specialties.
So. I think it's good, frankly. I think the interaction between different disciplines has a good effect.
What makes a good lawyer?
Oh my, who knows? It's a very interesting question. I've not given any careful thought to what makes a good lawyer. But a good lawyer would be the same as a good engineer, a good doctor, and whatnot. I'm not ready to say.
Okay. All right, let's go back and talk about politics.
Oh my.
Tell us about your interest in politics while your father was in Congress, before your father was in Congress, but early on.
Yeah. Well, I had a fixed, determination that I was not going to be in politics, that my father was interested in politics, especially after he went to the House, and there was no room for me, and I had no desire to be in politics. I was going to practice law, and I did. And by the way, the only other elective office I ever held was president of the student body at the University of Tennessee. And I sometimes cite that, and incidentally, I've insisted that the Baker Center at the University of Tennessee, which is and will become an even greater institution and an integral part of the university, must have a significant specialty in student government, not just the University of Tennessee, but the concepts and the utility and the success and failure of student governments. That's an outgrowth of my experience here. But also, this is way off the mark, I've endowed a small stipend for presidents of the student body at the University of Tennessee so that they can have a little more freedom to do things extracurricular, and that's worked out pretty well. But it wasn't until after my father died that really I developed any significant interest in politics. And
Tell us about that.
Well,
I know that after your father passed away, you got a lot of pressure to run for Congress.
Run for his seat.
Both immediately after and after Irene.
Chose not to run for re-election.
Yes.
And I didn't want to do that, and didn't do that. And why, I'll leave to others to figure out, but I didn't want to, and didn't. But Louis Donaldson and Dan Kirkendall and a few others came to me and said that you're going to have two seats opened. You're going to have the balance of the Kefauver term. He had died, 2 years left in his 6-year term, and then the regular seat, and wanted me to run. I can't really, to this day, tell you why I agreed to do it. It was more in the nature of an adventure than it was an ambition. But I did. I ran in '64 for the Republican nomination for the Senate and won that. And then ran against Ross Bass, who was a congressman, Democratic congressman, for the Kefauver seat in '64 and was defeated. But to tell you the truth, nobody thought I'd do very well. And I got 48% of the vote, which was not only surprising to many people, but probably was surprising to me. But by circumstance then, having an opportunity to run 2 years later at the regular time for the full filling of the Kefauver seat, I was able to build on that. And the 48% pretty well, I think, eliminated the idea that a Republican couldn't be elected. It was pretty close. So I ran again in '66 and was elected.
Big time.
Big time, yeah. Actually, it was 56% of the vote.
I remember you're telling me in the first election that if you'd had 2 more weeks, you could have won that election.
In '64.
Mm-hmm.
I think I could have. That's right. Because people began to understand or to believe that there was an opportunity to do that. You know, happenstance, circumstance, coincidence all have so much to do with everything in life, but particularly in politics.
Tell us about when you got up to the Senate now. Once you tried to get on an elevator, tell that story.
Well, first of all, you got to realize that I was 39 years old. And actually, I was 40 by the time I was sworn in. And I guess I looked even younger than that. And to tell a little story antecedent to that, in '66, when we had a little bit of money to run with and had some expert advice, the first advice I got was, for goodness sakes, go get a good picture so we could put it on the billboard. And they decreed that I should, my handlers decreed that I go to New York to Bachrach, which was a great photographer of Ben. We could barely afford it, but we did. And I went up there, went to their studio, and there were 3 or 4 photographers there. Just elaborate studio and lighting. And I sat there, it seemed like for an eternity while they talked. And finally, one of them came over to me and said, "Mr. Baker, would you mind if we painted some lines in your face?" Because they said, "You look so young that we've got to have to get a serious picture. We're going to have to do that in your makeup." And I said, "No, I don't mind." I've thought back about that. It's been a long time since anybody has suggested that. But I was young. I guess I look younger. But that's okay.
And then you tried to get on the elevator.
Oh, the elevator story, Bobby. Okay, you want me to tell that story? As I say, once again, I was very young when I went to the Senate and looked younger. In the Senate, they have a bank of elevators for senators.
Only.
And they have elevator operators who carefully check, especially in the early days, to make sure you're entitled. And this was the first day of the session. And I had trouble getting on, but then I also had trouble getting in the Senate chamber. One of the attendants tried to stop me. And I said, "Son, if you have any idea how hard I worked to get here, you'd have no idea that you could stop me now." But that's the story you're asking for. It really did happen. I'm not sure it sheds any credit on me, but it has only the virtue of being true.
What do you think about lawyers as lawmakers?
Well, you got a split opinion about that. I personally think it's an enormous asset to be a lawyer and to be involved in the formulation of public policy. You have a quicker, usually more extensive understanding of the intricacies of the process. Lawyers tend to dominate Congress. At least the majority of members are, or were, I guess they still are, lawyers by background. It's a tribute to the profession, not only because of their understanding of the field and their training, but also their inherent ability to deal with complex issues. I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good training. But I watched President Bush the other day make a speech and just heard him say, "We need somebody else other than lawyers up there." And I thought, I need to have a conversation with this young man because I think lawyers have been vital contributors. And I hope they will continue to be.
What were your impressions of the Senate when you went up? What surprised you? You'd had some background in government, certainly, with your dad and with Senator Dirksen being on board, but you must have had some some early impressions that you could share with us?
Well, that's a hard question, Bob. You're right, I do. I remember that first day vividly, but I remember even more vividly the first time I spoke on the Senate floor. By tradition, all new senators choose a time to make their maiden speech, so to speak. And I did that. It is also traditional that nobody is there to listen. But I spoke. Senator Dirksen was there. I'm sure he was there in deference to our family relationship, but he was there, and he sat patiently during the whole 40 minutes. I believe it was 40 minutes of my oration. And when I finished, nobody else was in the chamber, as I recall. As I finished and sat down, Dirksen came over and sat beside me. In silence, it seemed like forever. And then he turned to me in that deep, sonorous voice after my 40-minute speech and said, Howard, occasionally you might enjoy the luxury of an unexpressed thought, which has stuck with me since. But the Senate is a great place, great institution. I have a veneration and respect for it. I continue to. I get impatient, as a spectator sometimes with the deliberations and how long it takes, but that's in the nature of the Senate. The Senate was supposed to be that way. The Senate of the United States is the only place in our government where a single person can stand up and speak as long as they're able on whatever subject they intend to talk about. Can't do that in the House of Representatives, but you can do it in the Senate. They've changed it a little with the opportunity for cloture with a 2/3 vote, but it still has that special quality. And by the way, when I hear people say, well, we ought to adopt the House rules, I say wrong about the limitation of debate. We ought to be able to cut off debate by a simple majority vote, which some of my Republican friends and Democratic friends have all espoused. I say wrong. You're going to lose something of the character of the Senate if you further reduce the ability of a single person to express their views almost without restraint, because that is of the nature of the Senate, and I hope it continues that way.
Interesting. By the way, have there been other father or son-in-law combos in the Senate?
I think only one. I think Russell Long's father was in the Senate when he was first elected to the Senate. But I don't believe there are any others.
Tell us about Watergate.
What do you want me to tell?
Well, give us your view.
To tell you that I'm glad it's over, that we survived it. Actually, we came out pretty well. It's pretty hard on Republicans, but it demonstrated that the system works and that the American people could accommodate to it. We're not disillusioned. They were disappointed, but it didn't shake their confidence in the system. Is that what you want me to tell you? It's true. All of that's true. But what else? I don't know. It created a different attitude in television and the press. They all want to get a Nobel Prize. I mean, a prize for the most thorough, incriminating discoveries they can find. It emboldened senators to try to get the spotlight, I think, more than I remember. It too has changed the character of Congress and of the Senate in particular, but that job's not done yet. The country is still metabolizing Watergate. You mustn't start me on this, but I'm going to summarize it with one thing. I think I've studied the record in the Watergate hearings as much, perhaps more than anyone else alive. I was vice chairman of the committee. I was there every day. I watched these awful things unfold and develop. I watched the resignation of President Nixon, a man who was my friend, who I had made a seconding speech for in the convention. I watched all that. And I served in the Senate for a long time afterward, and I've thought a lot about it. And I've already expressed one view, that is, the principal result of Watergate was that we survived it. Second thing, though, is less profound perhaps, but I'm convinced that Richard Nixon did not know a thing about that break-in before it occurred. But he found out about it at 3 in the morning when he was in California, when John Mitchell called him. And he made a fatal political mistake. He decided at that point that he was going to contain it instead of liquidate it. It is clear to me that he could have lined up those people on the south lawn of the White House with TV cameras going and fired them. And he would have been a champion. He would have been a moral giant. And that would have been the end of that. But he didn't. And that was his mistake. And I think he would have survived had he done that. But he didn't. And it brings to bear my favorite saying, it's not the crime, it's always the cover-up. And indeed it was at Watergate. But people mustn't read too much into Watergate. People tend to think that one or the other of the parties is bad, the other one is good, or certain people are bad and others are good. That's probably true at some time or the other, but it's not universally true. And it's part of the genius of the American political system that we can take those assaults and insults and continue to function. And we are stronger because of Watergate than we were before. Politics is less convenient. The press is more brutal. But the country is better off in the final analysis. But having said all that, Bob, let me tell you, the greatest challenge to the security of America today, or its political system, is the deterioration of civility in politics. And we've got to come around to the realization that politics is a serious business. It's the way you select your leaders and express your views. It's not a game. Some way we have to restore some level of civility to the American political apparatus. I have no answer for how you do that, but I intend to say that as often as I have the opportunity.
Well, I certainly agree with you about that. Your question, what did he know and when did he know it, has gotten built into the language. How did you come up with that phrase?
Well, it's going to sound facetious, but it's absolutely serious when I tell you that after one set of hearings, I went to lunch with Ron McMahon, who was then my press secretary, in the one of the Senate office buildings. And I said to Ron, you know, the questioning in these hearings is going nowhere. It just wanders around. But the central theme is really, what did the president know and when did he know it? And I'm going to ask that question. And Ron said, don't ask that. That's got no zip to it. Think of another way to say it. And by the way, I did say it, but I remind McMahon of that every opportunity I get.
It went right to the heart of the matter. Tell us a little bit about...
And by the way, I answered your question, what did he know?
Yes, you did.
By saying that I didn't think he knew about the break-in, but he found out about it immediately after that. And that's the answer. People don't like that answer. They think that there's some more Byzantine answer to it, but that is the answer.
All right, tell us about the leadership in the Senate. You were minority leader and majority leader. How are they different? What powers?
Yeah, they're very different. They're very similar, too, in a way. By the way, they're not a creature of statute, and certainly not in the Constitution. They were created relatively recently, meaning in the end of the 19th century, because of the necessity for somebody to lead the two parties and to set the agenda, and that's how it came about. Majority leader, of course, has more power, but they're not extensive powers. The majority leader has two real powers. One is to be first recognized on the Senate floor, and the other is to almost the unchallenged ability to set the agenda the legislative agenda of the Senate. Those don't sound like great powers, but they are great powers.
Yeah, I'd like for you to elaborate a little on setting the agenda and why that's important.
Well, once again, the Senate is a free-form body, and anybody can introduce a bill. But it's almost always up to the majority leader to decide when that bill is going to come up before the Senate, or if it's going to come before the Senate. Unlike the House of Representatives, which has a Rules Committee, the Senate does not. So that's a vast power on the part of the majority leader. First recognition doesn't sound like much, but let me tell you, it is fundamental. For instance, if things get really out of hand and you've got a problem on your hands, you may be recognized at any point by the chair as a matter of right and make a motion to adjourn. And there are other aspects of that are important, but those two are the fundamental and cornerstone powers of a majority leader. The minority leader, of course, stands there as his counterpart, the majority leader's counterpart. He does not have those same powers, but it is also almost always so that you're not going to get anything done in the Senate unless you can get the minority leaders to at least agree on the scheduling. So the minority leader has a lot of power. It's passing strange, I guess, that these two non-constitutional, non-statutory roles, the majority leader and the minority leader, in effect have become so powerful. But they are. And I think it's worked pretty well. The one thing that I think but I think all Senate leaders must understand, whether the majority or minority, is that they are first members of the Senate. They're men and women of the Senate. Their first responsibility is to the Senate as an institution. There's a high need for cooperation with the president, but they are first creatures of the Senate. That's not easy to reconcile always, but it is absolutely essential.
What do you feel are your greatest accomplishments in the Senate?
Well, somebody else has to decide that someday. But in my view, two or three things stand out. One was the Panama Canal Treaty, which was vastly unpopular with many members of the Republican Party and with my delegation to the Senate. But I approached that as carefully as I could and decided it was the right thing to do and voted for ratification of the treaty. I can still show you the scars and bruises about my back to testify to the fact that it was not popular, but and especially since I was running for re-election at the very time you're talking about. But it worked. Surface Mine Reclamation Act, so-called Strip Mine Act. My good friend Lonnie Strunk from Scott County, during the debate on the Strip Mine Act, where I was the principal sponsor and came from Scott County, which was big into the coal business and the strip mine business, he called me up one day and said, "Senator," says, "you've got some of the maddest old friends and some of the strangest new ones that I ever saw. But I count that as one of my real achievements, and I do. I'm not trying to paint myself as a moral giant, but rather to say these things really took, if not courage, at least stubbornness to get through. Creation of the Big South Fork National Park, I hope will be remembered as a major achievement of mine. John Sherman Cooper, the late Senator Albert Gore, Thurston Morton from Kentucky, and I were the sponsors of that. And that park now has about 1 million visitors a year and is going along wonderfully. The environmental legislation, Ed Muskie and I were co-sponsors of the Clean Air Act, of the Clean Water Act, and a number of other pieces of environmental legislation. He was the senior Democrat on the Ways and Means Committee after the chairman. I was a senior Republican after John Cooper, who was chairman, was ranking member. And that took a lot of effort and perhaps even some courage. I remember one of the principal concerns about that was whether or not to require catalytic converters on automobiles, which the industry resisted violently. But now everybody accepts. I remember also the requirement for scrubbers on coal-fired steam plants, which was thought to be outrageous, but it's almost universal now. And then, of course, nuclear power. And that debate is not yet finished, but it will be. And I think people are going to understand that in these days of threats to the environment from global warming, that there is probably no other energy source that is capable of providing the enormous, prodigious amounts of energy that this world is going to require in the future other than nuclear power. So I think it will come into its own, and it should.
How do you balance political position with merits of an issue?
I never tried. You know, I was always mindful of the views of the electorate. I've already mentioned the Panama Canal, the Environmental Act, the Strip Mine Act, and even the Big South Fork. Most of my friends were opposed to the Big South Fork because it was going to tie up 180,000 acres of land that they couldn't cut the timber and couldn't do anything else on. But I don't claim that as a balance. All I can say about it is I thought that's what I ought to do, and that's what I did. And many things I may have been absolutely wrong about, but as long as it was my view, it was all right. I was okay with it. So I don't try to total that one way or the other. I just say, you know, you just put your head down and do the best you can in the legislative context, and that's not bad for the legal profession either.
You were majority leader and decided not to run for re-election.
Right.
Why did you do that?
18 years is long enough. And if you stay there for a while, you'll figure that out. And people used to say, well, majority leaders never retire. And I said, well, maybe not, but I'm going to. And yes, in the back of my mind also was the possibility of running for the presidential nomination again, but that was not the controlling feature. I will always be proud of the opportunity to serve as majority leader, and I'll always be grateful to the people of Tennessee for letting me serve the Senate for 18 years. But I never thought of it as a lifetime undertaking. And it occurred to me after 18 years, if you really believe that, you better go home. And that's what I did.
You told us about earlier about President Reagan asking you to become chief of staff. Let's talk a little bit more about that. How does the chief of staff position to the president compare with the role of the minority leader in the Senate?
Totally different, Bob. They really are. One of the great virtues of being majority leader that I should have mentioned is that you're absolutely your own person. As chief of staff to the president, you're absolutely the president's man. They're very different concepts. I enjoyed both. If you were to ask me what was the greatest political job you had, it would not be as chief of staff or as ambassador to Japan. It would be as majority leader of the Senate. But they're very different. If you want to get down into detail, I've already described the requirement to set the agenda of the Senate. I had no such responsibility in the White House. I had a responsibility to meet daily with the president at 9 o'clock in the morning in the Oval Office, just the two of us, and to talk about whatever we wanted to talk about or whatever he wanted to talk and then to carry out either his instructions or his perceived wishes. He seldom gave specific instructions. Reagan he was a very complicated person, but he had a very clear-cut, easily ascertained central core of conviction. And from that flowed every policy, every decision that he made. The real job of his chief of staff was to understand that and to carry it out. The way you carry it out, of course, is to pass on the president's wishes and demands to the cabinet and even to the Congress, and to do so faithfully. They're very different.
I think that's interesting that if you had to choose, you'd choose majority leader.
I didn't say quite that. What I said was, if you asked me for the greatest job I had, it was majority leader. If I were to choose again, I don't know. I had more fun as chief of staff.
Okay, before we talk about your ambassadorship, you had a tragedy in losing Joy.
She had a long fight with lung cancer, and she suffered greatly and was brave and courageous, but it finally conquered her.
Tell us how you got to know Nancy and how that.
Well, I knew Nancy in the
courtship came
Senate.
about.
You know, she was there, and she's an enormously talented person, very attractive person, and often a thorn in my side, because she's very independent in the Senate.
Now, this is Nancy Kassenbaum.
Nancy Kassenbaum. Her father
Yes.
was the Republican nominee for president in 1936 and was defeated by Franklin Roosevelt overwhelmingly. He was also governor of Kansas. But she's steeped in political tradition and ran for the Senate notwithstanding that. But she's very individualistic, very well educated. She's graduated from the University of Kansas and then took a graduate degree at the University of Michigan.
What'd she major in?
I'm sorry?
What did she major in?
Political science. And, but she does not mind me saying, she takes some pride in it when I say, well, she's often a thorn in my side in the Senate, but it's true. But that's how I knew her. I had not known her before she came to the Senate.
And you all were married when?
Oh, we were married on December 7th in 2000. In 1996. Be 10 years this December. 10 good years.
All right. You came back to practice law. We talked a little bit about that. You were a partner with Vincent and Elkins and with Baker Worthington. And then you got back into politics, if being an ambassador can meet that. Tell us.
I don't think of being an ambassador is in politics.
Tell us.
It is the most unpolitical job I ever held.
Tell us about it.
Well, I never aspired to be an ambassador, and was surprised when President George W. Bush, asked me to be ambassador to Japan. I was more surprised when I agreed to be, but those were 4 good years. But it is certainly not a political job. You know, I was as impartial and between Republican and Democratic ministers as I knew how to be. I was diligent and dedicated in expressing the administration's point of view, but also making sure that Democratic lawmakers who came to Tokyo had an opportunity to visit with officials of that country. But it's not a political job. It really isn't. And I think people understand that. And by the way, I was confirmed 99 to nothing, which is some testimonial to my nonpartisanship.
Did you get any training to be an ambassador?
Well, a little, not much, but the State Department runs a month-long ambassador school in Washington. It's dreary, dull, and I don't recall clearly any single time when it was useful in my service there, but they do that, and they still do that. But that was a great experience, and both Nancy and I really enjoyed our time there. The American ambassador in Japan has a special status. Too complex to describe in detail, but it flows down from General MacArthur when he was there, and Mike Mansfield when he was there, and Tom Foley when he was there, and Walter Mondale when he was there. You know, had a string of great ambassadors since World War II. But the most amazing thing to me, frankly, is that it's been only a relatively brief time since we were fighting each other in World War II in the Pacific. But now I think of Japan as our very best friend in foreign policy matters. And I think they think of themselves that way. And it's astonishing, given how mean we were to each other. But that's so, it's really so. And the similarities between Japan and the United States are remarkable. But anyway, it was an interesting experience.
You had a small staff. I was surprised to learn.
About 700, big staff. Actually, I think it was bigger than that, but 700 foreign service officers, than a number of others, but big operations. The American Embassy in Tokyo is one of the biggest embassies we have. And
Howard, before we leave the ambassadorship of Japan, give us your impressions of Japan as a world power and how they relate to other countries in the world.
Okay. It came as a surprise to me when I got there to see how American they were. MacArthur did a spectacular job at impressing the American lifestyle on Japan and giving them a parliamentary government that actually functions and political apparatus that actually competes. No, I was surprised with that. I guess I was surprised, although I knew it, to see how vibrant and vital Japan's economy was. And while they were in recession, which they're out of now, by any measure, they are the second largest economy in the world after the United States. And I think will continue to be, notwithstanding China's great growth in Southeast Asia. They're going to continue to be a great world economic power. What really came as a surprise to me, I guess I'd been told, but it still was a surprise, was that not only are they a great economic power, they are really a great foreign policy and military power. Everybody thinks of Japan as a passive country, and they are passive by nature and instinct, and I think will continue to be after World War II. But notwithstanding that, they have the second largest navy in the Pacific. Almost nobody knows that. And it is certainly the most modern navy in the Pacific. That's remarkable. It's not as remarkable when you consider they're an island nation and they live in a hostile neighborhood. But they got the second largest navy in the Pacific. They also have an air force, and they have, not a big one, but they have one that's very modern. And they have a missile defense system based really on the Aegis cruisers of the United States. But they're a real power. And they should be. I said they live in a dangerous neighborhood. They do. Who knows what North Korea is going to do? Kim Jong-il is crazy and unpredictable. I speculate even the Chinese, his best friend, sort of think that way. Certainly the Japanese do. And who knows what China's going to do about Taiwan. So altogether, it's a dangerous neighborhood. But I think Japan has pretty well adapted their defense apparatus to take account of that. Their economic activity, what they're going to be later remains to be seen. They have a dwindling population gradually, but they still have great technological prowess. My guess is that they will either formally or informally coordinate with China on how the economy develops in that region. But Japan is populated by smart people, by and large, well-educated people who are our friends. They are instinctively friendly to the United States, which is amazing considering World War II. But I think they'll continue to be that. I think that the cornerstone of American foreign policy in the Pacific depends on our relationship with Japan. And that really drove my vision of my responsibility as U.S. Ambassador to Japan. And I think it worked out pretty well. Koizumi, Prime Minister Koizumi, by the way, is a piece of work. He's talented, smart, canny, and a friend. And he's leaving in September. And my guess is his Chief Cabinet Secretary, Abe, will be a successor. Well, who can tell for sure, but that's my guess. And he's good too. He's younger. I'm not quite as sure as I am of Koizumi, but he'll be great. He'll be fine. And he is a friend of the United States. But Japan is an integral part of the future of the United States, the future of free world, the future of economic activity, foreign policy of our country and others, and I think a future source of stability in world affairs.
Foreign leaders, you've had an opportunity to meet, get to know a number of foreign leaders. I know you can't list them all, but who are some that come to mind that you were impressed with and can comment on?
Well, you're right. There are many, and most of them I met when I was working for President Reagan, because I was always at his side. The most impressive was Mrs. Thatcher, far and away. The other was perhaps Golda Meir. It's passing strange that they're both women, obviously, but they had strength. They had courage, both of them. They were willing to take the guff that goes with change, and I have an enormous admiration for them. Now, there are others. I've already mentioned Koizumi. I have a great respect for Koizumi. But I would pick those three as the most outstanding foreign leaders I've ever known.
That's interesting. I have a number of people who have said, what's Howard Baker doing? What is Howard Baker doing?
Howard Baker's practicing law. That's what I'm doing. And I also do a few other things from time to time. I serve on a few philanthropic activities. But, you know, my principal activity, other than my profession, involves the Baker Center at the University of Tennessee. I'm grateful that it was created by the University of Tennessee. It's an integral part of the University of Tennessee. Its new building is on the main campus of the University of Tennessee, and it's going to be an important part of the university. It will have programs, it will have classes, it will have seminars and retreats, it will have exhibits and the like, but it's not a museum. It will be a functioning part of the university system. So far, we've had 2-day seminars on the history of environmental legislation. Former Vice President Gore spoke, as did I. We've had a seminar on the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States, in which Winston Churchill's grandson came and spoke. We will continue with that. Those are open to the public, and I think is a good outreach program for the university. But we already have other programs where the university grants credit for those who attend, largely graduate students. We also have an archives, perhaps the best collection of political papers in the Southeast, beginning with President Andrew Johnson, Senator Estes Kefauver, and many others, including mine. But that will be my principal interest as I go forward. Sometimes people say, oh, you got to retire, and I say, of course not. There's too many good things to do, too many things I want to do. I'll retire when somebody taps me on the shoulder and say, it's time to retire. And I may not do it then. But there you are.
Well, Howard, I think you've got many years to work with the Baker Center and practice law, and I look forward to doing it with you.
So do I, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you very much.